Hello and welcome to Mobile in Black and White, the neighborhood series. And our topic today is voting. And we are just so pleased to have Dr. Sam Fisher, retired associate professor from the University of South Alabama in political science and in criminal justice. And we're just happy to have you. Thank you, Sam, for being here.
It's nice to be here. Appreciate it.
We appreciate you. And my colleague colleague and friend, Ryan Noble. Say hello to everyone.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I don't know when you're going to watch this, but we're recording this the day before the election. So it seems like a pretty important topic right on election eve.
Yes, and that's exactly why we have really just been so honored to have our guest, who I find is an expert, to kind of help us see how do we get to this point as it relates to voting. And Sam, let's just sort of talk a little bit about sort of, this place we find ourselves in the day before election, but then thinking about sort of how voting has progressed over time. Can you give us just an overview of voting in the United States?
Yeah, voting is something integral to our system, and we talk a lot about it. But when we go back to our founding, there's a reluctance to allow everybody to vote. So early on in our history, the only people that really had a chance to vote were white males, typically with property, and that slowly expands over time. And but again, we talk about representation, talk about voting, but the people in power are sometimes reluctant to say, well, I don't really trust that person's judgment, so I'm going to limit their ability to vote. And there's been this conflict, sort of the ideal of our system versus reality. And it continues today. Obviously, technically everybody can vote if you're over 18 with some restrictions. So we've vastly expanded the electorate, but at the same time, we've also put hurdles in the way.
So what are some of those hurdles and how have we sort of over time, overcome some of those? And maybe what are some things we need to really be thinking about moving forward?
Well, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it removed several hurdles. One of the things that in the South, we had a legacy of discrimination against minorities in terms of voting. So there are things like having to take a literacy exam, which had nothing to do with, whether you should be able to vote or not, but as a way to eliminate voters. Poll taxes are another example. And the notion is that you would have to pay a tax every time you voted. And if you had failed to vote before, you had to pay for those elections that you didn't vote in. And the notion was it becomes so expensive that it's going to eliminate people who are poor, who are more likely to be minorities. So in the 1960s, by constitutional amendment, they eliminated poll tax. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 sort of forced southern states and others who had minorities that were denied the right to vote to be able to vote. And then part of the process as people start to get these rights is getting into the habit of voting. One of the things when women got the right to vote in 1919, they didn't all rush out to vote. It was a matter of time. So women for a long time didn't vote as much as men. I remember when 18-year-olds got the right to vote, and we didn't all show up at the polls. And so again, part of it is getting the right to vote, and then part of it is actually exercising, getting into the habit and the practice of voting.
This notion of the habit of voting is really interesting to me. I think in a previous conversation, you and I, we've talked about, registering students at high school and, thinking about ways that people can vote more conveniently and more often. So what are some of the things, how can we get in the habit of voting?
Well, part of it is just thinking in terms of, my one vote is just one vote out of thousands, but it does carry some weight. And so when you add all my, if I vote and my friends vote, then that gives weight and substance, and that representatives have to pay attention. And so to get beyond the notion that does my vote really count? It does. And I think that's probably one of the biggest hurdles, is getting into that notion that, well, it's just one vote, but it's a vote that can count. Part of it is paying attention to what government does. Government has a big impact on our everyday lives, no matter who we are. And a way to have an impact is to go out and vote, to vote for candidates that you like in particular, that you think will be have good policies, at least policies that you prefer. And then part of it is getting to the notion that when you elect somebody, you have particular preferences. In all likelihood, there's no candidate out there that's going to line up on every preference you have. Okay, so part of it is getting now over the notion that, well, if this candidate doesn't believe everything I believe in, I'm not going to vote. And because you're never going to find that perfect ideal candidate. So part of it is the notion that voting is a compromise in the sense that you're going to pick the best possible person, even though that person may not line up with every particular value you hold.
I wonder, I want to jump in and just ask, that kind of brings up some sort of deeper psychological things too. Like, as an African-American, you might recognize, especially maybe in the 60s and 70s in the South, that there are no candidates that look like you or come from where you came from. You know, can you talk about how that sort of voting motivation can be sort of deeply held, like identity issues around, you know, representation?
Well, I think, you know, part of it is, you know, having a representative that looks like you, whether it's race or religion or whatever, is important to a certain extent. And part of the other issue is not just for minorities, but for the majority to understand that, you know, being Black, being a woman, and holding office is not something unusual. That's probably one of the biggest hurdles for minorities and for women getting into office, is getting voters to get out of the mindset that the only person that should be in office is a white male. And I think we're, you know, while it's not perfect, we're getting past that. So it is important to have people that reflect what the population looks like in office, and that gives it more legitimacy. So, you know, we would expect more women to be in office, more minorities to be in office than what we see now. So, you know, I think for minorities, it is important to be able to go out and say, I want to vote for somebody that sort of looks like me, who represents the values that I have. And I think that also represents a threat to those who, you know, white males who have always held power. So, you know, that's an encroachment on my ability to have power.
Well, I think I just saw something recent about the record number of women who were running for elected positions. And so I'm glad to see that that is actually happening, and people of color running. So what do we say to our public who really wants to sort of move beyond, you know, being able to see that, you know, what leadership looks like and how women are viewed as it relates to, you know, being able to take care of their families and things like that. I just think that historically, as we think about that, are there some things that voters need to know as they're, you know, really sort of moving beyond election day, like how to keep that momentum going?
Well, part of it is you know, keeping up with what government's doing, what sort of laws are being passed, contacting your legislator, contacting your congressperson, contacting your city council person, and letting them know what you think. I mean, in part, when we vote and we elect somebody, we're trusting them to make decisions that we would make. In other words, I don't have the time to sit on, in the Capitol and watch everything, but there are certain things that have a direct impact on me. So in my role as a former university professor, funding of higher education. And so I'd be very attuned to those sorts of issues. If you're somebody that runs a restaurant, you're going to be very attuned to issues that relate to food supply, health and safety issues, and things of that nature. And your representatives from the city level on up have an impact on those sorts of things. So part of it is trying to pay attention, get in the habit of paying attention to things that have a direct impact on you, and then get in the habit of letting your representative know, well, this is where I stand. I would like you to vote yes or vote no on a particular bill. And I think that will help reinforce voting. That is, voting's one aspect of trying to influence government, and the other is actually contacting and letting representatives know what you think.
Awesome. One of the things we talked about in sort of historical context was Holder versus Shelby. Will you talk to us a little bit about that and how it impacts us today?
Okay, yeah, Holder versus Shelby, if I remember right, it was 2013, and it was a Supreme Court case that involved the Voting Rights Act. And in southern states and other states where there had been a practice of discrimination, any changes to laws regarding elections, whether it's the way districts are drawn, the number of precincts, anything related voting, had to have pre-clearance. That is, the Justice Department had to approve or not approve those changes. And so with Holder versus Shelby, the Supreme Court threw out that section of the Voting Rights Act that required pre-clearance. And what that did is it freed states to do whatever they wanted to do. So we had the introduction of voter ID laws. When I first voted in Alabama, all you had to do was show up and, give them your name so they could cross you off the list. Now you have to show up and show a voter ID, a driver's license, picture ID, something like that, in order to vote. And that creates a hurdle. Not everybody drives. Not everybody has an identification card. So that means you need to go out and do that. And the notion is, if we make it difficult, you might not do it and you won't go vote. So a lot of I guess the other issue is we've had shrinking number of precincts. So it means longer lines. So I'm curious as to what it's going to be like tomorrow. And again, it probably places a hurdle. So if you're working, are you going to be able to take off for work and stand in line for 3 hours? So all of those things where before the Justice Department would have to, say, yes, it's fine, it's non-discriminatory. Now the states are free to do as they see fit. And so we've seen that in a lot of states in terms of voter identification laws, the numbers of precincts, how early you can vote, how easy is it to get to the polling place, and so on.
That's something that I'm fascinated with, because I'm so sort of viscerally connected to fairness. Like, I just feel like fairness is the most important thing. And from that worldview, it's like, well, the most fair thing is to make sure everyone gets to vote, right? Not that they have to go vote, right? Like, they get to choose if they want to vote or not, but at least everyone gets a chance to go vote. And so I have a hard time wrapping my brain around what the psychological or other disorder, I shouldn't say that, the psychological sort of the psyche of, like, let's find ways to keep people from voting. Like, where does that come from?
Well, it comes from a feeling that I have the power, and the only way I can maintain that power is by making sure the number of people that can go vote is limited, and limited to those who are more likely to support. You know, having political position brings power with it, and people are reluctant to give up power. Now, one of the dilemmas that we have is we've turned politics into a winner take all, as opposed to I win, but I still have to represent those who voted for the other candidate. And we're seeing less of that notion. And so as a consequence, you know, anything that might threaten that position needs to be countered by limiting who can go out and vote. So here in Alabama and other southern states, for Republicans, they know that minorities are more likely to vote Democrat. And so how do you write the rules to make it more difficult for those people who are likely to vote Democrat to have any impact? So you have voter ID laws, and you know, all based on the notion somehow that there's this massive fraud, when we've had study after study, especially by Republicans, who have turned up nothing in terms of voter fraud. So it's, again, a fear that, well, if somebody else is in power, I'm going to lose power. And sometimes I wonder, you know, if the psyche is, boy, if I lose power, these people might treat me the way I treated them.
Wow.
So I don't, you know.
That's deep and dark.
That's it. Well, I think, you know, I think there's a reluctance to say, you know, we can compromise, you know, I'll get some of what I want, but not everything. And then when the shoe's on the other foot, I can be assured that I'm going to be treated fairly. But right now, I don't think that's the sense. I think the psyche is, you know, if I lose power, then I'm going to get treated like I treat others.
Is there, yeah, no, and I get that. I mean, I think we're seeing that play out at a national level in this sort of tribalism that's happening, that there's so much like just take everything you can, and, you know, because you just don't trust the other side or whatever. I wanted to just extend something else that you said just a little bit more. You talked about Alabama, specifically in Mobile, either Mobile County or the city of Mobile. What other kind of barriers or obstacles are there for voters to be able to exercise their right to vote?
Well, mainly it's, you know, getting an ID if you don't have a driver's license, getting to the polling place if you don't have transportation, getting time off. One of the things that's always intrigued me is we're stuck with this notion we have to vote on a Tuesday. So again, if you're working, some people can get off fairly easily, others don't have that luxury. So that has a barrier. And with this particular election, because of COVID, people have been able to do absentee and actually deliver it in person, but you have to go down to the registrar's office to do that. Some states have mail-in voting, and they've been doing it for several years, and that would be something that would make a difference. And the other thing is that means if you're working all day on election day, you know your vote's going to get counted. So we have those sort of traditional hurdles. Some of them are going away, but you know, we can make it a lot easier to vote than we already have if we wanted to.
So along those lines, keeping registration as a constant effort, and knowing the importance of registration. I know this is one of the things that's important to you is how do people get registered, and why they should register so that they're prepared and ready to make their voting plan. Let's talk to us a little bit about registration and the importance of that ongoing effort in communities, especially Mobile.
Yeah. You know, it's actually, I went online to check and I looked at the registration form, and it's fairly easy to register to vote. You can do it online. You can print out a copy and fill it out and submit it. So the process is fairly straightforward, but it's a matter of encouraging people to do it. So I think, in high schools, it would be great if, if seniors, is part of their, one of their classes is everybody to register to vote. I think voting drives, get out the vote drives, that's important for communities to, go door to door and let people know that, you can, if you're not registered to vote, here's how you can register to vote. You can also, and this is one of the, I guess, other issues is in terms of technology, if you have access to the internet and computer, it's real easy, but not everybody has that access. And so that's where it's important for high schools, for local communities to be able to go out and bring the forms to people and explain how to get registered. And then part of it is not everybody has an ID. So there's a little box you can tick to say, I don't have an ID, but to help people find ways to get those IDs. So I think there are things that we can do to sort of get over those hurdles, but it takes, an active, positive activity by us to do that.
And as we're thinking about registering and thinking about how to really encourage that, what are some of the things that we need to think about in terms of who can vote and who cannot vote, and the efforts that are occurring right now for people who may have been convicted of certain crimes and things like that? Will you give us your perspective on that?
Well, in Alabama, if you've been convicted of a felony, it doesn't mean you can't vote. There are certain crimes. I don't have the list of them, but you can find a list of them. But it's not as bad as some other states, but that has been a big hurdle. So Florida is a good example where they're saying if you convicted of felony and you've served your time, you can vote, but then they added a requirement that you have to pay any fines, and which substantively amounts to a poll tax. But here in Alabama, there's certain crimes where if you've committed them and you've been convicted, you can't vote. But I think there are ways to appeal that and get your rights restored in terms of voting. But again, that takes an effort on the part of the individual. There's no sort of systematic way to say, okay, making people being aware of that, and also, what do you have to do to get your voting rights restored?
Well, this is a big task. It's a big task for us individually and collectively as communities to continue to think about the importance of voting and its impact on our lives every day and those who represent us. As we're sort of continuing to think about the history of voting, and particularly in our community, what do you sort of think, sort of see where we've come from and where we are today? And maybe what are some things we need to, I know we talked about a lot of things we need to continue to do, but how's Mobile progressed in this area?
I think we progressed in terms of like the city government, and we now have more representation by a broader spectrum of the community than before. I forget the name of the case, but there was a case that changed the structure of city government to make it more representative of the community, and also to reflect the community. So I think we've made great progress there. In the county government, I think same sort of thing has occurred. It's much more reflective of the population than it was 30, 40 years ago. So progress is, we've made progress in having city officials that look more like what the county is or what the city is, and that they have to be concerned about the whole community, not just part of the community.
What what do we want to know about how the lines are drawn in terms of districts?
Yeah, that's one of the ways in which you can have an impact is how the lines are drawn. And so as an example, in Alabama, when I first came here back in the mid 80s, in Alabama, there were 5 Democratic congressmen and 2 Republican congressmen. And there was a move to create majority minority districts. That is, to create a district where there's a likelihood, not an assurance, but a likelihood that a minority could be elected. And so there was a case here in Mobile about that. And it was sort of interesting because you had this unique alliance of Blacks who wanted to create a majority minority district, and then Republicans who also said, yes, we need to have that, because they saw that it is a way to concentrate Democratic votes and increase the odds of a Republican getting elected. And so we went from, and it worked, we went from 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans to 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats at one point. Okay, it sort of flipped. So how you draw the lines can have an impact on who's likely or not likely to get elected. And that's been a great source of controversy, because it can sort of, if you're in the state legislature and your party has control of it, then that means you can control how those lines are drawn to favor one particular political party. And we've seen that happen. And again, the courts have never been really clear on what constitutes a reasonable district. Okay, so if you look at maps of congressional districts, state legislative districts, they can all look fairly bizarre in terms of they're not nice compact squares or circles, but you've got all these strange district lines that sort of stretch out like a little neck going out to encompass a particular group of people.
Are there ways that people can have influence on what those lines are?
Again, it's a case of telling a representative, making some noise about it. It's also easier. I mean, you can go online. I took a class to Montgomery years ago, and we actually got to play with the district maps, and because it was all computerized. And so we were able to, gerrymander is the term for it, but gerrymander it to favor incumbents or particular political parties. And so the technology is there and accessible. So people should be able to see, okay, if we draw the lines in this particular way, it's going to hurt or help me. So it's very important that there's people tell their representatives, to try to draw it fairly. So some states have gone to bipartisan commissions to do the drawing in order to try to assure that it reflects, most of the state is one particular party, then they're more likely to have more representatives, but to make sure that it doesn't get too out of balance. In other words, one party having way more control than what it's reflected by the voters.
I wanted to ask, I know this is getting, I don't know, it popped into my mind while you were talking, so it must be related somehow. But that is this idea, I guess I'm getting this kind of chicken and the egg thing where it's like, it's hard for people to get motivated to vote because, it's like, it's stacked against us anyways. If I live in a district that is gerrymandered to a place where Republicans always going to win, and I'm a Democrat or vice versa, it's just like, what's the point? And then like the weeks or months before the election, everyone's like, this is the most important election of your life. And you're like, well, 2 days ago, I didn't even care because my vote doesn't count anyway. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of sort of push and pull. And I wonder if you have any comments about that.
Yeah. again, it's getting past that point that, okay, even though I'm in a district where the person that I would like to elect is very unlikely to be elected, if I become apathetic and bail out of the system, then that gives more power, influence to those that I would prefer not to be in office. So my vote, again, is not going to sway the election, but it's going to put on notice that, yes, here's a voter who is paying attention, that would like representation and should not be ignored. But that's a big hurdle to overcome. So, why should I bother to vote when I know full well that my candidate is not going to win? Because at some point, the tables may turn and my candidate will win. So it's, I guess, persistence and trying to encourage people that their vote really does count, even if they're not on the winning side. Part of it too is, again, let your elected officials know, even if they're not, your particular candidate, it doesn't mean you can't try to influence them between elections.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of where I was headed with that. It's like that's the feeling, the sense that I get too, that that habit of voting is what's important. It's like you're a lifetime voter, and you will cast a vote that counts someday, but you have to always do it because you don't know which day it's going to be. Right. Which is why I think it can be counterintuitive to yell about this is the most important election of your life. Because first of all, that happens every 4 years. Right. Like they said that 4 years ago. They said that 8 years ago. They say that. And then it's like, then it's not about habit. It's about this one time. Right. And, and so, that's my comment. I don't know if you want to comment about that at all, but yeah, that sort of counterintuitive, this is the most important one. And then that throws out the idea of like, well, no, actually being a voter every time is more important.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the hype is always going to be on this particular election. Yeah. And so I don't think there's any way to get around that, other than to, encourage people to not think in those terms, that it's think in terms of the long game. That is, I'm in it for the long haul, and especially for young people, who are just getting started in the work world. They're more focused on what's happening now, for my friends, as opposed to, how does the elected official have an impact on the type of job I could get or the community that I live in, and so on.
What are some of the things we need to do to learn about our candidates?
I think, it's not easy, but to nail them down, where do you stand on issues A, B, and C? And, what is it that you hope to do? And again, the other thing is there's no candidate out there that is going to give you an answer on A, B, and C that you totally like. Okay, there's always going to be. So I think part of it is getting voters to look and say, okay, this is not the perfect candidate, but overall, I think he's going to be representative. That's one of the reasons why when you talk to candidates, sometimes they're a little bit fuzzy because they're trying to please everybody. And so, but it's important that candidates get pinned down on where they stand on different issues. And again, not to be surprised that on those 4 issues that they don't stand the same way you do on each of those issues. I think the other thing is to hold representatives responsible, that they have to represent everybody. In other words, if I'm a Republican in a Democratic district, that when that person's in office, they do have to listen to me and pay attention to some of my issues, or at least compromise. Or if I'm a Democrat in a district that's absolutely, totally Republican, again, the notion that you can't write me off because I'm not Republican. And I think if we emphasize that to, you know, these members of Congress or state legislatures or city council, that it's not an either or thing. That is, you have to pay attention to all of your constituents and try to do the best by them. So sometimes you're going to get what you want, sometimes you're not, but there's going to be some point at which I get something of what I need as a constituent.
Well, one of the reasons we made voting one of the neighborhood series topics for Mobile in Black and White was the importance of it. Will you talk to our listeners and viewers about the importance of local, state, and national elections on our daily lives and how it impacts our communities, our families, and us as individuals?
Well, it's, you know, they write the laws and vote on laws and legislation, taxes, you know, funding of public schools, getting potholes filled in your neighborhood. City council has an impact on that. Street lights, having clean water, having airports that you can, you know, fly in and out of. The federal government provides a lot of funding for those sorts of things. Here in Mobile, the port is very important to our livelihood, and the federal government and state government have a big impact on, you know, providing funding to develop those, which can create jobs. I think, again, at the most basic level is just, you know, physical things in our city. You know, how does the infrastructure look like? Is it easy to get across the Bayway? Okay, you know, are they going to build a new bridge and make it easier to go back and forth between Mobile and Baldwin County? So in our everyday lives, it, you know, whether it's the city government or the state or the federal government, has a big impact. And so if I'm running a business, I want to have roads that my goods can be transported on. If I have kids, I want schools that my kids can get a good education at. I like to go out and eat at restaurants, but I want to be assured that, you know, that there's good sanitation so that I don't get sick. So there are a lot of things in our everyday lives that are impacted. Construction codes, you know, can I be sure that I've got a house that's going to hold up to all the hurricanes we're having, you know? So yeah, it's very important. Weather, the federal government provides a lot of information on weather, and that's important if you're a farmer or if you're in construction, or if you're about to take a holiday, to be, you know, have some confidence that, okay, I can rest assured that it's going to be a good week to go in terms of the weather.
Ryan, you have any other questions for Dr. Fisher?
Well, just that, I guess, you know, the idea of, you know, city governments meaning so much, I think that's really compelling. What you were just saying about just listing off all those things. I mean, again, we just had a hurricane, so all of those ideas around like building codes and, you know, a weather app and an emergency alert system, and, you know what I mean? I just like all those little things you sort of don't think about, and yet they make our lives so much better. And, you know, especially compared to like 50 years ago or 100 years ago or whatever. And yet those local elections are the ones that have even the least voter turnout. Right. So I guess, I don't know, it just struck me that that's yet another reason to have this sort of habit of voting, right? Mm-hmm. Like every time there's an election, you just show up.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is like in this election cycle, there's been this big thing because of COVID, obviously, for everybody saying, you know, have your plan to vote, make your plan to vote, make your plan to vote, you know, that whole thing. It's like, maybe we should be making plans to vote in every election. Like, you know, our plan should be, how are we going to vote in every single election, whether it's local, state, county, You know what I mean? Because they do happen like every year, right? There's
Right.
almost a couple times every year. There's one election or another, right? So I don't know. You have a comment about my little inspirational coach speak there?
Yeah, it's that's sort of one of the dilemmas is we have lots of lots of times when we vote, and there's this whole notion of voter fatigue. That is, you just get tired of showing up to vote. So we need to do that regardless. The other thing is for voters to encourage their state government, local government. Well, why don't we minimize the number of times we have to go out and vote and put elections together? That is, if there are ballot issues, don't have a separate time to vote on a special election or have a special election, but try to put them together all at the same time. Here in Alabama and in many other southern states, we have runoff elections. And that's, again, it means that we have to go out and vote multiple times, and you have all the same sort of issues of getting access, getting time off, and stuff like that. So one of the things we should think about is, how can we, one, minimize the number of times we have to go out to vote, or two, how can we make the process easier? Should we go to mail out everybody a ballot and they can just put it in the mailbox, or should we have places where we can drop off ballots, have a window of 2-3 weeks where you can cast a vote at multiple places around the city or the state? So there are ways to deal with it. But again, I agree with you. And there's this whole literature on, the more often you have to vote, it tends to depress turnout because people just get sort of tired of showing up to vote.
Well, Dr. Fisher, we are just so pleased that you would spend some time with Mobile in Black and White, our neighborhood series, to really just explain and get us started talking about the history, how we've gotten here, what types of things we can do moving forward. Are there any parting words as we can sort of conclude our interview time today?
It's just, I try to encourage my students, to go out and vote, and that it does have an impact on your lives, even though we sort of feel like it doesn't have an impact. But when you sit down and think about it, it does matter who you put in office. And also that voting in and of itself is not the end all or be all. Part of it is, again, contacting your representative between elections and letting them know whether it's the person you voted for or voted against. And I think that's important to stay active.
Well, thank you so much for just your time today. We're so delighted that you would share your expertise and all the different things that we need to be thinking about as we're continuing to engage and making sure that we're Mobile in Black and White, the neighborhood series, is a part of that engagement moving forward in our community. So thank you again for your time. And we appreciate you and all of your expertise.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.